Welcome to the Color of Success podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. I am so excited to welcome a very esteemed guest, May Lee. She is an award-winning broadcast journalist, host of the podcast, The May Lee Show, adjunct professor at USC, and the founder of Lotus Media House. Familiar with racism at a young age, May was fueled to become a prominent voice in the effort to combat anti-Asian hate, and she found this voice through journalism. So she is a woman of my heart. May's international experience as a broadcast journalist began in 1992 at Japan's NHK network, and over the years expanded to Tokyo and Hong Kong as a correspondent and main anchor with CNN. In 2000, May joined the dynamic new women's network, Oxygen Media, founded by none other than Oprah Winfrey, as one of its main talk show hosts. She headed back to Asia in 2004 to join CNBC Asia in Singapore as the primary anchor and now resides in Los Angeles. As the start of 2020, when anti-Asian hate especially exploded during the COVID-19 pandemic, her production company Lotus Media House partnered with NextShark, which is the leading Asian online news source, to launch The May Lee Show, the first pan-Asia talk show for women. Each episode, May sits down with the most impactful and relevant Asians in the US and around the world who are boldly enhancing and elevating Asian voices and issues. She is recognized as a powerful voice for Asian Americans, especially women. She was named one of Forbes 50 over 50, leading the way to impact in July 2021. Since then, she's been working with various organizations, companies, and media outlets to raise more awareness of AAPI history and experiences. Please join me in welcoming May Lee. Hi, May. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's so good to be with you, Stephanie. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I was so shocked that I get to sit down with a living legend. I don't get to do that a lot because I'm kind of.
Well, I wouldn't go as far as saying a legend, but thank you for the compliment. It's my pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I mean, you've been all over the world. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your experiences traveling, all across Asia, working there, and how that's kind of impacted your own identity.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate to be able to live and work all over the place and a lot in Asia. And to be honest, when I started my career as a broadcast journalist, I never really thought about going overseas. I never really had the vision of being a foreign correspondent of any kind. But when the opportunity came at the age of 26, so I was pretty young, to move to Tokyo to work for NHK, I had to take it. There was no doubt that if I were offered the job, I would take it. It's a scary prospect to move overseas at a relatively young age, but it was the best move I could have ever made. Living and working overseas gives you such a different perspective on life, of course, right? Oftentimes, I think in America, we become so US centric.
Yes.
About everything, and we don't look beyond borders. We think that America is the center of the universe, which it is not. And so there's so much more out there. And so Asia, as someone of Asian heritage, it was a great opportunity, for me to develop professionally, but also discover my Asianness much more than I had ever before. So it was great.
How do you feel like it was contrasted? Because in Tokyo, obviously, it's a little bit more homogenous. I love Tokyo, by the way. It's an amazing place. And I hope after the pandemic that I can go back with my family. But I mean, I imagine that there is definitely a contrast between being in America as an Asian woman and then going over there, especially at 26.
Yeah, no, of course. First and foremost, yes, it's very, homogeneous society. So it was kind of a culture shock in some ways for me to all of a sudden be in a country where everyone was Asian, just about, right? But it was also an interesting experience for me going as a Korean American because I was looked upon as Asian, not Japanese, American, but not white, right? Yes. So I was sort of in this weird gray area. So that was sort of an unusual experience for me. But overall, I had never been in a situation where I was one of all Asians mostly. And so that was a unique experience. And as a journalist, I wouldn't say in Japan it gave me an upper hand just because I didn't know the language when I first moved there. So I was seen as definitely a foreigner, a gaijin, right? Even though I looked Japanese, they knew I wasn't. So that was a little bit of a challenge. And then as an Asian female, what was interesting also is that, to this day, Asia, many parts of Asia, it's still a, patriarchal society, right?
Sure.
And so women still aren't equal. I mean, let's be honest, they're not equal here either when it comes to pay and other issues. But in Asia particularly, it's still not a balanced society that way. So I still had sometimes a struggle as an Asian female correspondent. Even though I was working for very established media, they still sort of sometimes the more conservative Japanese men that I would try to interview would maybe not want to make eye contact with me, or they would be a little bit surprised that I would walk through the door. So that was always kind of like, oh, okay, I'm up against a little bit more of a challenge here than I thought. Yeah.
How did you navigate the language barrier? Because that is a difficulty when that being thrown into a new country, just any country at that.
Yeah, no, I was very fortunate. NHK, because of the show that I joined when I moved over there, it was a business show in English. So it was for the Japanese market, but also international market. So they knew that the people that they hired, most of us on-air people, would be English speakers because that's, the language that was preferred for the show. So they actually had producers who were Japanese speakers who would act as translators for us. So, it was a advantage for me because I didn't have to be fluent in the language. Now, as I, lived there, of course, I picked up on the language. I never became totally fluent, of course, but it got a little bit better and I was able to get around, but still when it came to advanced Japanese and communicating and doing formal interviews and things like that, I would never try to do it, in Japanese. I would always have a producer / translator with me. So it made it a little bit easier, obviously. Yeah.
What about in Hong Kong? How was your experience there?
Hong Kong was a completely different experience in many ways because I went from Tokyo to Hong Kong. And I went right before the handover of Hong Kong back to China from British rule, so in 1997. And going from such a formal, restrictive society in many ways that Japan is, right? I go to this freewheeling, buzzing place that was called Hong Kong, and dense and crowded and aggressive. It was really a different experience. So I kind of got a culture shock going there from Tokyo, from this very formal, polite society to Hong Kong, where everyone was just like, get out of my way because I got to get somewhere.
I'm really scared to go eat dim sum there because I heard people push.
Oh, they push. And you pretty much have to scream and yell, for them to stop the damn cart, to be able to serve you some dim sum. But I always use this story to illustrate how fast-paced Hong Kong is. Every door close button on the elevators is rubbed off. I swear to you.
People are just trying to close the door.
Once they get into the elevator, they're just pushing that door close button. And if they see you running for the elevator, they will continue pushing the door close button. Because in Hong Kong, it really is true. It's like time is money. So everybody is in a hurry to get somewhere because time is money. Don't wait. You got to get ahead. So that was the difference when I got to Hong Kong. It was fun, exhausting, really exhausting.
Is that what led you to come back to America? I mean, what led to kind of the transition? I'm sure your career took you in various ways.
I was in Tokyo for 4.5 years, and then I moved to Hong Kong, and I was there for another 3.5 years. Right, so that was a good chunk of time that I was in Asia, and so I felt ready to come back to the U.S. after that, almost 8 years there, and then I got this opportunity to join this new women's network started by Oprah Winfrey. I mean, how can you refuse something like that, right? So I went to New York and joined this network called Oxygen Media.
Mm-hmm.
And it was such an exciting place to be because, you know, I mean, who doesn't love Oprah? I mean, she's seriously my idol. And the idea of working for a network that was all about women, empowering women, women's issues, very Oprah-esque.
Mm-hmm.
And then being elevated to the main talk show position of being one of the co-hosts, I couldn't have asked for a better situation. So it was a transition, though, not just coming from Asia back to the US, but I went from news, like hardcore CNN news, to then being the co-host of this sort of Today show / The View combination. So that was a little bit of an adjustment for me, too. So in some sense, that was kind of culture shock, both professionally and personally.
Absolutely. And I mean, during 2020, there's been a lot of sociopolitical contributors to publicity of Asian American hate. And, you know, it has been so disturbing. I mean, I have two daughters who are younger. I mean, my oldest is turning 10. That's kind of insane.
Okay.
So I think there are aspects that mental health professionals and communities could really get involved in and continue to highlight some of the things that are going on. Through all your experiences, what do you think has contributed to the increase in hate crimes, the increase in publicity, and maybe what we can do as mental health professionals to help out?
Well, that's a lot that you just brought up. And I think all of those issues are so important right now. Let's start from the beginning. You know, the reason why there's been all this anti-Asian hate is, of course, it's a knee-jerk reaction to COVID, right? It was the blame game in 2020, where because COVID originated from China, there was a blame, right? People always want to look for a scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So in this particular case, it was Asia. And so because of that, it just stirred up all of this anxiety and panic and blame. But if we look historically at the Asian American experience, this has happened over the course of many years, you know, almost 2 centuries.
Yeah.
Since Asians first came to America, you know, the biggest influx being the Chinese immigrants,
right,
who came in the 1800s to build the railroad and do other things. And so since then, there have been many events throughout history that we can track. And I actually started a course at USC called Asian American History and Journalism because I really wanted to delve into how history and some of these horrible events throughout history have proven to all of us that Asian hate has existed for many years.
Absolutely.
This is not new. This is not just COVID. So it just goes to show that all of these things that have happened have compounded, you know, this racism that has never gone away, you know. So being Asian American, it's a conditional thing. We're accepted until something goes wrong. Right. So Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, the Japanese incarceration because of Pearl Harbor, you know, Japanese car dumping and, you know, the invasion of Japanese, you know, the economy, destroying the US economy. So all of these factors throughout history have added to this anti-Asian hate. And then add to that the model minority myth, you know, that has worked against us. So that's the historical aspect that has led to all of this that continues to this day.
Absolutely.
What that has done, though, is that the attention, of course, has been building because of everything that's been going on. And I think the difference this time is that the Asian American community itself, we have become more vocal. We have started saying enough is enough. We're not sitting on the sidelines silently saying, okay, we'll just keep our heads down and hopefully it's going to go away. This time you see a very powerful movement of Asians speaking up, speaking out, taking action, becoming activists, you know, protesting, demanding change. And so this is where I see a difference compared to what happened in the past. There have been blips of activity, trying to make inside change, but it's kind of gone away. This time I see sort of a sustainable movement within the AAPI community. And that's obviously creating a ripple effect. So we're starting to see that change, which gives me hope, but we can't give up. We can't just say, oh yeah, everything's better now, so let's just go back to normal. We see mainstream media doing that now.
Right.
They've kind of like let go of the story, but we within the AAPI community and our allies need to keep up the work.
Yeah, I get most of my Asian American news from NextShark as well. I think, they've highlighted so many stories, and it's not only kind of these quote unquote larger stories, it's in the community, personal, how it's impacted people, Asian Americans coming together to donate to causes, help families out. And I mean, it's just incredible to see that. And, all of the Asian American YouTube creators, like the old school ones, I would say that, I mean, they're my age, but the old school ones that have come together to really, create this movement and this voice. And it is very empowering. And I'm just so glad that you started the course at USC, because I asked my daughter's school, are you going to be covering Asian American history? And I think it's really important at a young age to understand this cultural context and this historical context. I mean, my ancestors worked on the railroads. We helped build this country, and that's really important to not forget that it was built on our backs.
Yeah, now, and I think that education, it has to start with education. You ask anybody, did you learn anything about Asian American history in school? And pretty much 99.9% of people will say no, right? And that's a sad thing. That's really a sad fact. So that's why little by little, we all need to push and make the demands to incorporate that into education, into the curriculum. And I'm starting to see that happening in different school districts, which is great. But parents, kids, everyone needs to, we need to push for that, because it starts with education, which builds that knowledge and awareness, which then leads to empathy. Because without that kind of information and educational background, how are you supposed to develop any kind of empathy if you don't even understand where this person came from and what their history is? So that's key.
And there's so much out there, there's a lot of buzz. Social media is huge, right? It wasn't like that, until I got to college. And so where does someone start? Like kids, educators, because it's really overwhelming for some people to say, I need to learn my history, my people's history. It's a lot.
It is a lot. And I'll tell you something, because I had to put this brand new syllabus together for this new course that started this fall, I was overwhelmed. I was like, oh my God, I don't even know where to start. But I'll give you the good news. There's a lot of resources out there now. Particularly because of what's happened in the last 2 years.
Right.
So because of this raised awareness, more and more journalists and authors have been putting out publications and books and articles and stories and documentaries. I'll tell you a great place to start, a PBS documentary called Asian Americans. It was, I think, 4 parts or maybe 5 parts, but brilliantly done. Just beautifully done, and such a great historical, reflection on the Asian American experience. So I always tell people, if you want a whole overview of Asian American history, watch that documentary, because it's so well done. It ran last year, but it's still available. So I would recommend that. But there are so many books now written by modern Asian American authors about the Asian American experience. And there's just so much now to dive into that you can just go online. I mean, we have something called Google now, and just go ahead and Google whatever topic you want. And I promise you're going to come up with so much material that you can dig into.
Yeah, I definitely make it a point to purchase books or check them out at the library for Asian American authors. It's been really great to see that they're being pushed more, at least in mainstream media, for people to buy it, to have that platform.
Yeah, I mean, look, we just saw the introduction of a new Asian American character on Sesame Street,
Yes.
right? Jiyoung,
Uh-huh.
first Asian American character. And, talk about an educational introduction for kids, right? Through Sesame Street, where when we were growing up, that was unheard of, right? We would have never expected an Asian American character to talk about her heritage or her culture or, being accepted or not. So
Mhm.
that again is a pretty big step in the recognition and the awareness that we need to see more of, which is
Right.
which is really hopeful.
Well, representation is so important. And I try to explain to my youngest because she's like, is this person Asian? Is this person Asian? And it's really hard. It's like, does that person look like you? I mean, it's a really complex um, construct to really explain. And as well as, you don't want to just stereotype people based on how they look. And at the same time, it's like people need to see a reflection of themselves and
Yeah,
and not in a cartoon, stereotypical way that
right.
makes fun of Asians and Asian Americans.
Yeah, those stereotypes we have to break down, and we are slowly doing that through media and entertainment, of course. And I mean, like it or not, media and entertainment, you might think it's shallow, but it does reach the masses, right?
Right.
And it does have a great influence on individuals, especially kids. I remember growing up not seeing any Asian faces unless, yeah, they were the stereotype caricature villainous dragon lady or martial arts expert, things like that, or the geek, the nerd.
Right.
And so that has an impact, that has lasting impacts on our own self image, right? And our own sort of either, I've talked about this in a show that I recently did, sort of self hate and internalized racism
Yes.
that we have. And those are things that are, again, reinforced by media and the narratives that have not been controlled by us until now, and we're starting to take control of the narrative, which is the way to do it. Right, we got to tell the right stories in the right way.
Right. And I think there's geographical differences too, because I grew up in the Bay Area, born and raised, versus some of the folks that I've talked to on the show, they were one or two Asian Americans in their school. And just this idea that they're maybe white adjacent or they just didn't fit in. And we're seeing that too in college data and college admissions of like, quote unquote, are Asian Americans really ethnic minorities? And like you
Right.
said, there's this contrast between white adjacent mono minority, and then when something goes down, we are other.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So it is a conditional acceptance. And I think, I grew up that way too. I was the only Asian kid in my school. I have an older brother, but he's 5.5 years older. So he was already like in junior high when I was still in elementary school. So yeah, so for a long, long time, I mean, I didn't really even know what to call myself, right? Because I thought I just wanted to be white or at least be accepted into the white community. And so that can really screw somebody up for a while, that sort of lack of identity or confusion about identity. But yeah, so I think now, like your daughters, hopefully are getting a lot more exposed to the idea
Absolutely.
of real identity and being both of both cultures, but being American, fully
Mhm.
American, but also having that Asian background and Asian history. So I think that's really important to incorporate.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the aims of this show, obviously, I'm a psychologist, and is to destigmatize mental health care. Now,
Mm,
what's positive is I'm seeing so many more Asian American clients. And so we are breaking down those barriers. And particularly with COVID, people are just experiencing a lot, not just Asian Americans. But
yeah.
I mean, you talked about empathy. How can we break down these barriers to actually asking for help? And especially when there's generational gaps in how people view mental health.
Yeah, that's something that I also grapple with, especially since I see that in younger people because I'm a adjunct professor, right?
Right.
Here's the discovery I've made is that young Asian females, women, are really still struggling with a lot of issues, right? Of being Asian, being female, still being sort of treated in a dismissive way, and still struggling with identity, and they're trying to find their own empowerment.
And
Um,
fetishized too.
and well, that ultimately, yes. I mean, that's where they're feeling like, there's still these stereotypes that exist, right? And so the mental health aspect, but the problem is that a lot of them still don't want to ask for help,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're a little fearful. They have the anxiety, but they're afraid to admit that they need the help. Or, of course, they're not speaking to their parents about it because there's still that stigma within the Asian community of seeking counseling or therapy or things like that. Now, interestingly enough, my father was a psychiatrist. So I grew
That's
up with the
amazing.
notion, yeah, I grew up with the notion of, therapy and, getting help and things like that. But it's so funny when I look back on my childhood and growing up, I still looked at it as something that was very medical because my father was a psychiatrist. So it
Mm-hmm.
was like more psychiatric help and,
Medication.
medicine and medication, things like that. And not so much therapy. I didn't make that connection. As I got older, I obviously realized, there was therapy involved too. But right now, I do hope, and I emphasize this often, that we have to destigmatize this, particularly in the Asian community, that asking for help, reaching out, talking to somebody, going to therapy should not be a shameful, embarrassing thing. We all need it. We all need to have a talk. We all need to get some sort of guidance on occasion,
Mm-hmm.
no matter who you are, where you're from, what your socioeconomic status is. So I really want to emphasize that, this is something that we shouldn't be ashamed of. It's there because, it's there for you. Reach out. I just put out a social media video about the holidays saying, oftentimes it's the loneliest time for people, and they isolate themselves. But why? Don't do it. Please,
Yeah.
please don't do that.
I mean, it's a strength to ask for help. I just released an episode on suicide assessment and prevention. And
Mm,
the interesting part is according to Dr. Gelzo, you know, people actually, suicide rates are actually higher in the spring. And I think it's a lot of things are going on at that time because, people are able to somewhat hold it together during the holidays and then the weather changes and, it's like, well, things are starting to loosen up a little bit. And so
mm,
I think the thing too is to be able to talk about emotional changes because we're all human, like you said. We all go through ups and downs. I
yeah.
mean, the movie Disney movie that I love is Inside Out because it really talks about the importance of not only having happiness or trying to shoot for that, but like the sadness piece helps you contrast those emotions and identify them.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really powerful position that you're in because you're not only teaching about the historical context, but it's my appeal to say, hey, we need more Asian American mental health professionals and psychologists because that representation is really helpful to see that your therapist looks like you too. And there's a somewhat of a trust. I'm not saying that all Asian Americans have to have Asian American therapists, but as you know, like in the community, there's an aspect of trust there that happens.
No, I'm going to jump in right there with that point, Stephanie. And that is, I do think that is an issue because when I've sought out therapy in the past, I actually did want to find somebody who was Asian
Mhm.
because I knew that I would be talking about family dynamics and tradition and culture and things like that, that I wanted that level of understanding because that is a huge part of mental health, right? When you have to deal with family and your past and parenting and all that, these things. And I had a very difficult time finding somebody who was Asian. And so I did go to one or two therapists who were not, and I found that there was a lack of connection on that level.
Cultural competency.
Yes, and so some of my students have also sought to get counseling. Students are going through a difficult time because it's just been a horrific 2 years for them.
Mhm.
But And some of them are Asian, and they're saying, yeah, I need to find somebody who's Asian. I'd rather speak to somebody who's Asian. Again, we're not dissing non-Asian therapists, of
Right.
course, right? But there is that level, I think, of understanding that needs to be there to understand the depth of somebody and their background and what they're grappling with. So yeah, I mean, listen, I've thought to myself, if I had a second chance at like a career and I, put this broadcasting career aside, I would totally consider being a therapist, because I think there's a huge need for that level of understanding. I really do.
Yeah. Well, there's a second career for you always waiting. So, I'll wait for you on the side. Well, you've done a lot, in your career. And I guess I'm wondering, what are you most proud of? You're still doing a lot.
I don't know. And this is not I'm not trying to be so modest, but I started out this career with a clear direction of wanting to be a journalist, because I love the aspect of storytelling. I loved meeting people, and I really wanted to satiate my curiosity about the world. And then as I developed my career, I really just grew to appreciate the fact that, being a journalist is a true privilege, because it allows us to really literally go up to people and ask them questions, and they feel compelled to answer because you're a journalist. But what it also allows me to do is give a voice to the voiceless, to give attention to subjects and people and places that deserve some attention that maybe have been neglected. And now, because of the work I'm doing with anti-Asian hate and, trying to raise awareness about the AAPI community, again, I'm just like the vessel, right? I'm the one who's just getting the information out there and allowing people to speak through me. So I guess that's what I'm most proud of, really, is that I've stayed the course. I have never allowed my journalistic career to get to my head. It's never been about the fame. Mm-hmm. It's never been about celebrity, which I will say some people in this business, that's what they like, right? They love the recognition. They love being famous.
I liken it to a drug, really.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think for some it is. And, but that's never been it for me. And so it's always been about the work. And it's always been about like, okay, what can I do with my platform and my skills as a journalist to try to do something right? And I think that's why I'm someone who actually is very, very focused on justice, and doing the right thing. So sometimes I go very far with the justice thing, because I get so angry when I see an injustice in the world.
Yes.
So that's what drives me. So I think if there's anything to be proud of, it's the fact that I've stayed the course, and stayed on mission.
So tell me about Lotus Media, because I think that it sounds like it all is related, but what are you hoping to do in that sphere of your life?
Well, Lotus Media House it started because I wanted to launch a talk show in Asia when I was still in Singapore. So I was with CNBC at the time, and I looked around and I noticed that there were a lot of Asian women becoming much more empowered, independent, and they were evolving throughout Asia. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be cool if there was a show of some kind that represented this, kind of modern woman of Asia? And so I started this production company called Lotus Media House, thinking, okay, let's start this company so that then I can develop this independent show to be able to launch this. And so that's what happened. I started the company, I launched the show, and it was the first iteration of the Mei Li show. So that was the show that was actually about the Pan-Asian woman. The description that you read, actually, this show that I do now, the podcast, is just about AAPI community. It's not not about women. So that's how Lotus Media started. And since then, I've just, taken the company, in terms of media production, consulting, training, teaching, education, speaking engagements, all sorts of things. So it's just an umbrella company now, that sort of represents everything that I'm doing.
That's It's amazing. And I know you've done this a long time in even taking interviews, but what's one question that you wish someone would ask you?
Oh God, that's a good question. What's one question I wish somebody would ask me? I think there's a fear of a lot of people of asking somebody about personal personal life. And I don't mean delving into things that shouldn't be shared, but it's very, very rare when somebody asks me if ever been married or if I have kids or anything like that and why I made those choices. And so, for women out there, especially younger women who sometimes wonder about the pressures of society, right? Because we still live in a society that has these expectations of women, particularly, right? Oh, you should be married. Oh, you should eventually have kids. That's just the way it is, right? Instead of ever questioning, well, why, right? Why do I have to feel this way? And if you don't, then you're looked upon as like, what's wrong with her?
There's a stigma, definitely.
Yeah, what's wrong with her?
Mm-hmm.
Well, guess what? I have never been married. I don't have children. And, in my past, I always thought I would, just because you're supposed to, right? We're just programmed as women to think we're supposed to. Well, it never happened for me because I made some choices. My career took me elsewhere. And so here I am. But it's interesting that people don't bring that up very often. And sometimes I wish they would, because I really do want to share that it's okay not to follow the rules,
the norms,
because
so to speak.
The norms. Yeah. And so, and especially as women, I think we live under such pressure to think that we have to do it this way because society says so. I think Jennifer Aniston is a perfect example. She has said in a couple of magazine articles, it's like, why is it that, women to this day are judged according to their marital status or their, children or not having children, things like that. And so she feels like she's stigmatized, to this day as well. So
absolutely. And divorce is a whole nother Pandora's box that we can talk about. But,
exactly.
I definitely think that there are aspects, and I'm slowly working on my book, but this whole thought of like expectations too, of even working parents. I mean, I had my kids at a relatively younger age, I think, just a year older than when you moved to Tokyo. And so I thought, oh, my friends are going to have kids around the same time, but now they're like their first birthday party. We're going to like for 1-year-old birthday parties, and like my kids turning 10, and it's just a completely different ballgame. But this whole idea of like getting a PhD, being pregnant at the same time, like all these things, intersecting, and I know who I am as a woman. I'm actually grateful that I had children at a younger age, because now like I can teach them some of these things that I've learned along the way. So, I mean, what would you tell, this is a common question, but I'm very curious, is like, what would you tell your younger self now that you've gone through all these experiences?
I would tell my younger self not to be so afraid. Because growing up in Ohio as the only Asian kid, as a girl who was petite, to boot, so that didn't help matters either. I think I had a lot of fear, right? I was afraid to speak up. I was afraid to stick out. I was afraid to be who I was, because I knew inside there was something that wanted to come out, but I kept that down. I repressed all of those feelings and that authenticity that I knew I had inside because of fear. So I would tell my younger self, don't be so afraid. It's okay. And even if it doesn't go right, it's okay. You'll get over it. You can just move on. You'll pick yourself up and move on. But that's a lesson I think comes with experience. And as you get older, of course.
Yes.
And fear, I always tell people, can be very powerful. It can be very useful because it can motivate you, right? It can motivate you to change. It can motivate you to push forward and then realize how powerful you are. So fear can be a very useful tool as well.
Well, it's such a relevant message even now, right? As
Yes.
young girls are growing up. I mean, yes, there's more STEAM programs and trying to build self-esteem, but that
Yeah.
whole idea is that there is this fear programmed in young girls to speak up or be good at
Yeah.
math or science or whatever it is. Like, even
Or
if you
just
don't want to do
behave,
that. Mm-hmm.
just behave. You're a girl. You need to follow these, standards and rules and things like that. And, yes, there's something to be said for, being civilized, of course, but there's also something to be said for pushing the envelope
Mm-hmm.
and finding your true voice.
Well,
Yeah.
and that, one of the most dangerous phrases that I hear is, "Oh, well, they're just boys. That's what they do."
Oh, boys will be boys.
Yeah.
We've heard that. We've heard that talked about the former president of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to get political, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's always the excuse. No, I call BS on that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
Was there any other imparting message that you wanted to make sure to mention, or kind of any inspiring things that you wanted to leave the audience with?
no, I mean, I think, going back to the mental health issue, I really do think that because of the pandemic, obviously things have been exacerbated, and in the area of mental health, for sure, it has been struggling because of everything we've all been going through collectively. But I really don't want this to be the second pandemic, right, of mental health issues and illness. And so I really just want to, also commend you for talking about these issues. And I think
Thank you.
continuing to talk about these issues and make it okay, right? Let's strip away the stigma and make it okay to be vulnerable, right? To be open. Being vulnerable is not a weakness. It's actually a superpower. If you're vulnerable,
Yes.
you are able to connect with other people because then they're going to see, oh my gosh, you feel the same way too, right? And so I think we need more connection right now. We've been so disconnected in so many different ways, and social media and all the technology actually makes us feel more disconnected than connected. Right. So we do need to get back to a sort of genuine form of connection, and sharing, opening up, being vulnerable, I think is the way to go.
A question that I often get is, what components are present when you have a meaningful relationship versus a superficial one? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh boy. A meaningful relationship to me is, one is being totally vulnerable and honest, right? With, about yourself to another person. Because if there is any sort of hiding or veiling or superficiality, or again, social media is a perfect example of where you're just trying to like create this image,
Right,
that is perfection, right? Oh, my life is so great. Look at my beautiful family. Look at my unbelievable vacation. All of these things that create this sort of fantasy that's not, it's
real.
fake, right? It's not real. And so genuine friendship, relationships, any kind of, connection has to start with that truth and that vulnerability, that true honesty with each other. And it might not be pretty, right? But gosh, if you start with that foundation of truth and honesty, then, I mean, how much stronger can you get? It's like that foundation you're going to build a relationship on that strength, that powerful foundation. It can only get better and stronger.
Yeah, I think of Simone Biles, who, I just applaud so much for speaking out about that. And I mean, yes, social media is a B because people also say, nasty things, but there's an overwhelming outpour of support and people that understand that aspect of like trying to be a perfect performer for your country is a lot of stress.
Is a lot on her shoulders. But that's perfect evidence of she decided to be vulnerable. She decided to be honest about her weakness and, what she was going through. That's why people responded. they didn't respond to the fact that she's an Olympic gold champion, gold medalist. They responded to the fact that she was being truthful about her vulnerability. So that goes to show that when you do that, people want to connect more with that because they get it and they themselves feel the same way. So that's proof of like, if we were all just to put our guard down a little bit, I'm not suggesting strip away everything, but just put your guard down a little bit to somebody and you'll be amazed at what the result will be.
Absolutely. My closest friends and family like have seen all of it, right? Like the ugly cry, all those things, right?
That's right. The anger, all of that, it's just like, just be honest about what you're going through, the good, the bad, the ugly. Right?
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. And, it wouldn't be me without saying, I don't need fame, but May, if you ever interview BTS, I need to be there. Like I just came back from the concert. So
girl, you're ahead of me. I just posted on social media. I go, I think I'm the only Korean I know who has not been to the BTS concert this week in LA. So I heard it was it's been an incredible series of concerts. So
I know. Yeah. I wish I went to all four, but hey, I have to be a responsible parent and professional coming back to the Bay Area.
At least you got to go. So good for you. I know that they're an amazing group. I'm so proud of those boys. They've done incredible things. And they've also done a lot of great work to help, young people kind of get out of their funk and depression and connect, right?
Because they make me so happy.
Yeah. And they've been vulnerable about themselves as well.
Mental health.
So, yeah. So we need more of that in the world.
I always say like, I make money to provide for my family and be an army because it ain't cheap.
So I've heard. Yes. But anyway, well, I'm glad you got to go.
Well, thank you so much, May, for taking the time. I mean, this, again, like I said, even after meeting you and having this vulnerability, you are a woman of my heart and someone that I definitely now look up to. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me on your show, Stephanie. And thanks for the work that you do to help others, deal with their issues. So it's great work that you do. I admire that.
Thank you so much. And I hope we stay in contact because there's so much work to still be, doing at this point.
For sure. Let's do that. Let's do it all. We have to all do it together. So, All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to the Color Success Podcast. Listen, like, subscribe on all major streaming platforms, YouTube, IG, and if you want exclusive content, you can join our Patreon. All links can be found at colorofsuccesspodcast.com.